The controls that the body has for blood pressure, those controls are not meant for a chronic condition, something that's long term. The controls of the blood pressure and the blood flow, they're actually meant for acute situations. If you remember, we have some other ways to check for the blood flow. We have the baroreceptors, we have chemoreceptors, we've got the nervous system. Baroreceptors, if I'm not, hopefully you guys remember, they're located in the artery and the carotid arteries that are branching just off of the aorta, and they're able to monitor those pressures of the blood as it leaves the heart. And it's very important because these can function minute to minute and respond to the stretch in those huge elastic arteries and help to regulate the blood pressure. The chemoreceptors, they are found throughout different areas of the body, and they're monitoring the gases. What's the oxygen? What's the CO2? What's the pH level? And once again, they function minute to minute, and they help to monitor that blood and the chemical makeup. The central nervous system, if it has an ischemic response, ischemic means there's, something is happening at that tissue level, at that cellular level. Usually, it's in response to high CO2 or a low pH, and it can actually kill the tissue. So that is being monitored also. In the baroreceptor, the areas where the baroreceptors are found, they can send the information to the areas of the brain, get a response, affect the heartbeat, the heart rate, the blood flow, and help control that pressure that they're monitoring for. So if the pressure goes too high or too low, it has a negative feedback loop to help bring those blood pressures back under control. If we look at the chemoreceptors, same information, but this time monitoring those chemicals, the oxygen, the CO2, the pH. And once again, if those gases, that information on those chemicals, if something goes too high or too low, they are working on a negative feedback system to bring the levels back into concentrations that are normal for the blood. If we have the ischemic response, basically we'll have a slowdown of the blood flow to the medulla oblongata, usually not a huge regulator for blood pressure, usually only kicks in emergency situations. And what happens is when we reduce the blood flow to those areas of the brain, we get an increase of the CO2, we affect the pH, we decrease the oxygen, and that's going to affect that center of the brain. Now, hopefully the goal would be to correct this problem quickly, because if the nervous tissue is being denied the oxygen, being denied the blood flow, we can begin to have the brain metabolism fail to the point of death because it's not getting the oxygen that's needed to keep the brain under control. This system for the adrenal gland, the medulla of the adrenal gland, this one also is a short-term regulation, And this would be that sympathetic stimulation where we get the release of the epinephrine, and that stimulates the heart and the blood vessels. And once again, this could be an emergency situation. And the overall goal is that it's a short-term control over that blood pressure and the blood flow. Now, the body does have the ability to affect the blood pressure and the blood flow for a longer term regulation. However, the body, under chronic conditions of high blood pressure, it really needs some extra help. So we do have some other mechanisms, such as the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone, which is going to involve the respiratory system. We have the antidiuretic hormone. The atrial natriuretic mechanism is from the heart. Fluid shift would be the shifting of the blood flow to areas of the body. And then, of course, the stress relaxation, a biofeedback. The goal, if we have a long-term problem with blood flow or the blood pressure, these mechanisms, they're trying to bring blood pressures and the movements of the blood under control for maybe a chronic situation. In some cases, these mechanisms can begin to start immediately, and they can last for hours or days or even longer. And their job, help keep the blood pressure within a very narrow range so that it's going to be beneficial to that organism over the long term. The renin, angiotensin, aldosterone, we'll talk a little more about this when we get into the respiratory system, but just begin to study this slide right here for this particular system. We mentioned ADH when we were talking about the endocrine system, and if you remember, one of the things about that, it was to help increase the water reabsorption by the kidneys. This right here is showing how we can have this feedback cycle for the long-term control. Now, from the heart itself, we can have the atrial natriuretic mechanism, and this comes from cells that are making up the atria of the heart. This is a hormone that will be released. It will actually go and act on the kidneys, and what it will do is it will increase the rate of urine production and sodium loss. So what we begin to see is the arteries and the veins begin to dilate, and what this will begin to do is decrease the blood pressure, trying to bring the blood pressure back under control within the system. With the fluid shift mechanism, the fluid shift mechanism is where it can act very quickly, and the job is to make sure that the small changes that occur across the capillaries, that what we're doing is we're maintaining the blood pressure so that we can move those fluids in those actual tissues at the capillaries. The stress relaxation, think of biofeedback. It can be very effective if people can recognize something that begins to affect their blood pressure, and if they can begin to go through the training for the biofeedback, and they can actually work to bring their blood pressure down, maybe through breathing techniques, vision, doing visual exercises and so forth. Now, as the blood flows and we move into those capillary beds, the goal is to have exchange at the level of those capillaries, moving that substance in and out at the area of those capillary beds. The most important way that we do this is diffusion. So materials such as our glucose, our amino acids, hormones, oxygen, CO2, all of this is going to be moving in a diffusion movement. So when we look at the exchange that will take place at the capillaries, what we're going to find is there are pressures inside the capillaries and then pressure outside the capillaries, and we're going to find that those pressures affect the movement of the materials. The hydrostatic pressure, hydro meaning water, this is the pressure of the blood that is flowing through the vessels, or what is the fluid in the internal spaces around those capillaries. The osmotic pressure is where we're looking at the movement of the solutes. Basically, what's happening between the blood versus those interstitial spaces. So the pressures that are going to be involved, it's termed net filtration pressure. Your book is going to talk about some math that goes along with this. Now, the net filtration pressure is just simply the hydrostatic pressure minus the osmotic. Now, what makes up the hydrostatic pressure is something called, what we have is our blood pressure, and then interstitial fluid pressure. What makes up the osmotic pressure is going to be the blood colloid osmotic pressure and the interstitial fluid colloid osmotic pressure. Think back to what a colloid is. Blood is a colloid because it is a substance that has particles in it that get to keep their physical structure. The same thing applies to the interstitial fluid. There are particles that get to keep their physical structure. They do not dissolve in the fluids. And what we're going to find is there are pressures inside the vessel versus the pressure of those interstitial spaces.